So I'm going to continue to talk about some walk cycle variations. So coming out of that last scene, the figure walked up to the camera, and I talked about how that becomes a hard cut because he disappears, and then when you move into your next scene, potentially something very different is happening. So having him move up and fill the whole frame is one way of creating a transition. But let's look at how I do the walk side to side. So it's very similar to doing a walk in place. The only difference is that you have to go into each segment and double click and move the figure starting just off the screen, and then as you proceed through, you'll start to move it slowly through the screen until you've completed your cycle. If you want the figure to walk a little more slowly, instead of doing your regular 8, you could do 8 of them until they hit the center, and then copy and repeat and do the second 8 until they walk off. That'll keep it from them speeding through the scene so quickly. Now if I want to create a transition between the last scene where he's walking forward and the new scene where he's walking across, I can come to that splice in between, set my marker at that point, and then I'm going to do a right click or a control click and scroll down to apply default transition. Pull this up a little bit. So I've got the apply default transition. Now it's going to depend on what I've set my transition to. So I want to go ahead and open up my effect control window. I'm sorry, my effects window. And in my effects window, just going to enlarge that a little bit. I'm going to go down to video transitions, and then within that dissolve. And so now we have a crossfade, a dip to black, a dip to white. So in this case I'm going to choose the dip to white. To move the default, you would select one and right click it, and then you can choose set to default. So now if I set a default transition, that would be a dip to black. So I'm going to set this one to the default, and then when I come back to my timeline and I right click, I can scroll down and apply the default. So I'll make sure you can see this, apply default transition, and that will be a fade to white. And then after it's in there, I can kind of scroll back and forth and take a look at how it's working. If I want to increase or decrease the duration, I can double click on it and change the number of frames. I'm going to leave it as is. So now I have my figure walking forward, my fade to white, and then my figure walking across the scene. Now if I want to have just a little bit more fun with this, I can add a foreground element. So I prepared a drawing of let me make this visible, of a parking sign, and made it transparent and just brought it in as a single image, imported it, and then I put it on a new layer. If you don't see a new layer visible, if you just lock your other layers, when you pull the image in, it'll automatically create, you can create quite a number of layers here. So I brought the first image of the parking sign in, and I did the same thing with it that I did with the figure, except that it's not moving, it's just sliding across the screen. So I had to do a little bit of thinking. If you want, you can do a test video and kind of see the background should be moving a little bit slower. The figure should be moving a little faster than the background. The foreground should be moving even faster than that. If you think of what it looks like when you look out of a car or a train window, there's a slightly different speed to the mountains in the background, the cars on the other road, and the street lamps or the parking signs that are whizzing by at a faster rate. So now I will be able to have my transition fade to white, have the character begin to walk, and having the parking sign begin to move at the same time. Then a little bit later on I decided to experiment with what would happen if I put two figures in there. So I did exactly the same thing. It's kind of a combination of the figure walking across the frame and the parking sign technique. And I also enlarged the figure in front to keep with the perspective. I could also make him smaller and put him further back on the sidewalk. You still want to make sure that where you place him in the space is believable in terms of perspective. But as you can see, you can get your basic walk going, and then you can begin to add elements that are going to make it a little more interesting. And that's it.